This is Just Right. Sweet Haven Farm Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 3. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 1. Chapter 1. Maybe if she hadn't been bitten by the neighbor's pug when she was 8. Maybe if it hadn't taken 12 stitches. Maybe if she hadn't spent 3 nights in the hospital after it got infected. Maybe. Avery Conrad had to quit blaming everything on her childhood, especially since she was almost 30. And currently hanging from the light pole in front of Greg's hardware store on Main Street in Love, Pennsylvania. The giant red and white candy cane strapped to the pole had blocked her from shimmying to the top. There was not enough money in her bank account to pay for any damages to the town's Christmas decor, even if they had enough of said decor to tastefully decorate a town 4 times the size of Love. Currently, considering the events that had necessitated her precipitous climb, she was very thankful that her best friend for the past 5 months just happened to be a former circus performer who had tried, with minimal success, to teach Avery a few tricks. The next time she saw Jillian, she'd have to report that she'd mastered the pole climbing part of the contortionist hanging by her hair routine. Necessity was the mother of survival, or however that old saying went. Pursing her lips, she looked at the dogs sniffing the bottom of her temporary residence. Black, long-eared, long-haired, and quite loud. Their teeth were rather large too, thank you very much. Her eyes drifted a little farther to the scuffed hiking boots of the man who had spoken to her less than a minute ago. In what had to be only the 2nd or possibly 3rd time in her life, she'd not been able to gather her wits to answer back. Yet. She'd have to get down from the light pole before she could comfortably read him his pedigree. There was just something gauche about her current position that negated the authority she hoped to convey. "I said they're harmless. I promise." His deep voice reached her, reminding her of the timpani part in Nielsen's 4th Symphony. "I was bitten when I was younger." She tightened her grip, thankful she hadn't put her gloves on. She probably wouldn't have gotten up the pole while wearing them. He gave a low command, a word she couldn't hear, and the dogs trotted the few steps to his side. Once they had stopped barking and his voice could be heard, they seemed to listen fairly well. Avery put her forehead against the cold pole. Flakes of snow drifted past her nose. She could pretend to be comfortable and want to stay in her current position, which would be ridiculous and an obvious lie, of course, although hardly shocking to anyone in town. She could get down and give the guy the tongue-lashing he deserved, but that would mean getting close to the despicable dogs. Or she could slide down and stride away, ignoring the very large man and his ugly dogs. Avery slid awkwardly down the pole. It was high time she faced her fear of dogs. Her feet landed with a plop and a scrape as her right foot slipped on a soft patch of ice. Her legs shot out from under her and she flailed with both arms and feet, trying to regain her balance before she landed with a thump on her bottom, one leg stretched out on either side of the pole. Her butt stung, but her pride stung more. She could make this look like she did it on purpose. It would be a stretch, but she could bluff her way through. She had to get up first. A single car ambled down Main Street. The horn honked. Avery threw a hand up without looking at the driver. Better to assume they were laughing with her and not at her. although the close-knit folks in love had already pegged her as crazy. Sometimes it was just better to play along. With one hand on the pole, she scrambled to her feet. Unfortunately, because she was being careful to avoid the ice patch, she leaned too far to the left, lost her balance, stumbled, and smacked her head with a hollow bong against the green metal of the pole. Pain pulsed in her head and radiated down her arms to the tips of her fingers, which throbbed. A small shower of red and silver confetti rained around her from the candy cane at the top of the pole. Any second now, it would cut loose, dropping down and smacking her on the head. That seemed to be the direction her life always went. She might have been able to pretend she landed on her butt on purpose, but there was no way she could pretend she meant to smack herself in the head with the pole. At least she was on her feet. She glanced up, only to meet the beady red eyes and glistening white teeth of a ferocious hunting dog. Saliva dripped to the ground as the dog licked its chops, no doubt thinking her Armani wool, cashmere-lined jacket looked an awful lot like a hot dog bun, and thinking she, of course, would taste an awful lot like a hot dog. "Please call off your dog." She meant to say it with authority to the man now in front of her, but it came out on a scratchy whisper. What kind of man allowed his dogs to stand over a helpless woman, salivating and dreaming of banquets and hot dogs? A total jerk, obviously. His hand fell back to his side. Probably he had extended it to help her up, but she hadn't noticed and it was too late now.
"Gladys, sit,"
the man said with a suspicious hitch in his voice. Her jaw clenched. He was laughing at her. Usually she didn't have a problem laughing at herself. After all, this kind of thing happened to her all the time. All the time. But to have this arrogant stranger and his snarling, starved dogs... Wait. Gladys! What kind of person named their dog Gladys?
"Yeah? I guess I should have called her Bruiser or Fang or Eats Ladies for Leisure."
There was that deep, tympanic vibration again. The vibration struck her right under her diaphragm and caused an unfamiliar heat to expand under her heart. She sucked in her stomach to stop the odd sensation. "You can stop laughing at me any time. Don't you have somewhere to go?"
"Wanted to make sure you were okay. That was quite a hit you took."
He jerked his head up, pointing with his chin.
"Thought the candy cane might get loose and make it a 2-for-1.
"Wouldn't have surprised me," Avery mumbled, for some reason finding it hard to let go of her irritation. Maybe because both dogs were now looking at her like she was lunch. At least the throbbing had slowed to a dull thump focused solely in her head. The man bent and picked up the bags she'd dropped. He held them out to her, his fingers long and calloused. Brown. The thumbnail was black, like it had been smashed by a hammer. The man nodded at the pole.
"I'm sorry about that. They know they're going hunting tonight and they're excited."
The vibrations hit her diaphragm again. Taking a deep breath to shove the unfamiliar sensation aside, she snatched the bags filled with Christmas decorations and lights out of the man's hand. Avery looked up. Way up. Man, sometimes it sucked to be short. She was going to drown in snowflakes if she looked this guy in the eye while she talked to him. "Whether or not they're going hunting, there are still leash laws in this town." It was never easy to sound condescending to someone who was almost a foot taller than she.
In the future, you could avoid this whole unpleasant scenario if you simply remember to keep your animals leashed while within the town limits.
Yeah, lady, I could.
One side of the man's mouth hitched up, revealing a fascinating dimple at the edge of his lip.
But I don't know why I'd want to. It was pretty impressive watching you shimmy up that pole. I sure hope you're registered for the lumberjack contest at Love's Christmas celebration later this month.
Avery planned to march in the parade, playing her tuba. Nothing more. Hopefully, shortly after that, she'd know if she had been accepted to the Washington, D.C. Evening Tide Orchestra.
"I've never been mistaken for a lumberjack,"
she said, unable to soften her words with even the hint of a smile. His lip hitched up a little more and the dimple deepened.
It wasn't a mistake.
"Of course it was a mistake. I'm barely 5 feet tall. Your wrists are bigger than my biceps, which you'll have to take my word on, since I'm not taking my coat and sweater off in this cold. Not to mention, if I took off my outerwear, your dogs might decide that's a dinner invitation."
Yeah, I suppose that little old lady they had for breakfast didn't stick to their ribs too well.
Avery couldn't keep her mouth from dropping and her eyes from widening in the second before she realized that he was kidding. Probably. She eyed the dogs and inched backward, just in case. Her back hit the pole and she stopped. "Have a holly jolly Christmas" grew loud, then soft again as a young teen opened the hardware store door and walked out. He nodded at them before he turned and shuffled down the otherwise deserted sidewalks. Unfortunately, the dogs didn't take their eyes off Avery. Something that looked like regret or possibly pity flitted across the man's face.
"I'm sorry my dog scared you."
"You're not acting sorry, and they're still here."
"They'll leave when I do."
A muscle ticked in his strong jaw.
"When I was training them, I never thought to include a command for them to go sit in a corner while I helped an otherwise elegant woman down from a light pole. I'm short-sighted that way."
Avery's lips twitched. She buttoned them down. After all, she would have walked away from this conversation 5 minutes ago if she weren't terrified to turn her back on those ferocious animals.
"Where I come from, dogs do not go off their leashes, for any reason."
"I was born in this town, and these dogs were born and bred to be off-leash."
"Not in town."
"They haven't touched you."
"They don't need to touch me to make it clear as day they want to eat me."
Something close to a growl came from the man. The vibration in her diaphragm did double time. But she was a classically trained musician who had never been the slightest bit interested in the tough, outdoorsy type of male. Plus, in her experience, men didn't stick around any longer than it took them to catch the eye of something prettier and younger, so they weren't worth her bother. Double that if said man came with boots and dogs. Whatever those vibrations were, Avery knew what they weren't. Not interest and not attraction. Not for the tough, boot-wearing, dog-owning mountain of a man in front of her. A muscle in the man's cheek worked back and forth. He knelt slowly, placing a hand on each dog's collar.
"I'll hold them until you leave."
Avery tilted her head and smiled the smile she used after a wretched performance that the audience clapped for anyway.
"Fine. Now I can walk away, unworried about whether or not I'll get eaten before I make it to my car."
She turned. Before she'd taken 3 steps, she heard whining behind her. From a dog, she thought. Tempted to ignore it and continue on. After all, she had holiday cheer to spread. She shifted the heavy bags and glanced over her shoulder. The man had stood up and started to turn, no longer having his hands on the dog's collars. He, too, was glancing back over his shoulder at the animals. One of the savage beasts had Avery's leather glove in its large jaw. It whined again. Avery froze. Fear, like a cold hand, gripped her neck. It was like the dog was doing to her glove what it wanted to do to her.
"Hey, Gladys,"
the man said softly.
"The fancy lady dropped her glove and you want to give it back?"
He turned completely around. Avery felt his gaze on her, but she couldn't lift her terrified eyes from the beast that held her captured glove.
"How about I do it for you?"
he said as he bent and plucked the glove from the jaws of death.
"Stay,"
he commanded before he strode to her. In unison, the dogs sat, watching Avery with evil eyes and polished fangs.
"This is yours?"
the man asked when he stopped in front of her, holding up her glove. She tore her eyes from the beasts of prey and licked her lips. "Yes." Her voice was barely a squeak. "It is," she said more forcefully. He cleared his throat. She imagined he was trying hard not to laugh at her.
"Do you want to take it?"
he asked slowly, waving it as he spoke. The bags of decorations meant to cheer Mrs. Franks made her arms ache. Transferring them to one hand, she snatched her glove. "Thank you," she said through her teeth.
"I'll pass that on to Gladys,"
the man said, failing to hide his smirk. Avery's eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on the dark stubble of his angled jaw. No interest. Not on his part, since he could barely contain his derision for her, and most certainly not on hers. "Tell her she'll have to find her supper somewhere else." Avery craned her neck to meet his dark eyes before she turned and strode away. Gator Franks opened the back door of his mother's house slowly. It creaked. He didn't want to wake her if she were sleeping, as she often was before supper. He'd finally shaken the unsettled feeling from the unfortunate confrontation in town with the fancy woman and the light pole. The whole thing really wasn't his fault, since little Braden Carper, all of 9 years old, had opened Gator's pickup door to pet his dogs, accidentally letting them out. But he hadn't been able to explain that to the woman, because it would have been too much like admitting she was right, and his experiences with his ex had taught him it was a huge mistake to admit weakness to a woman. Give them your throat and they'll go for the jugular, rip it out, tear it to shreds, then go after your heart. Every time. It really didn't matter that the woman had been as opposite from Kristen as could be, except for the money angle. They were the exact same there. His toe stubbed something in the dark and he grabbed the hall table to keep from falling. His fingers bumped into something cold, which wobbled. He grabbed for it in the dark, but only succeeded in knocking it over. It hit the edge of the table before tumbling to the floor and shattering. Something glass, obviously. He hesitated, not remembering anything either on the floor or on the table early this morning when he'd left the house. "Gator?" his mother called from the living room where he'd probably awakened her from her nap. The treatments made her tired.
"Yeah, it's me. I don't remember seeing anything here earlier when I left."
"Avery was here. She helped me decorate for Christmas."
Gator filed through his memory, but came up with a blank on anyone named Avery. He'd been living out west for 10 years, but the town hadn't changed that much.
"Avery."
The couch squeaked as his mother moved.
"Don't get up, Mom. I was trying to be quiet and not wake you."
More squeaking indicated that his mother ignored him.
Avery Conrad. She's related to Fink or Ellie Finkenbinder somehow, and she came out from Philly or near there this summer to help with the farm. I thought she had a teaching job there, but she never went back this fall, so I guess she didn't.
A light flipped on. So much for his mother's nap.
She offered to decorate, and since I know that you hate the knickknacks and whatnots and wouldn't want to mess with them for me, I took her up on it.
His mother was right when she said he hated knickknacks, and this was a big part of why. He was big, and they always made him feel like an elephant in an antique shop. Gator flipped the hall light on and grabbed the broom and dustpan. He knelt to sweep up the pieces of...
It looks like I killed one of the wise men.
We'll pretend Herod found that one and ordered his head chopped off.
She gave the pieces a sad look. He guessed they were expensive, but her tired eyes crinkled as she smiled at him. He shrugged.
Looks more like he planted dynamite under the camel's saddle.
If you toss the pieces in the can, it'll get rid of the evidence, and the cause of death will be whatever we make it.
I'm sorry. I was trying to sneak in and not wake you. I didn't know you decorated.
As he stood holding the pieces in the dustpan, he realized that he'd tripped on the most grotesque snowman he'd ever seen.
Is that thing made out of burlap?
Lights wrapped around the dumpy brown body, sort of like a droopy hangman's noose, and a shiny orange plastic carrot stuck out from its face. It brought to mind an ugly Christmas sweater, only in 3D and sitting in his house.
I bought that at the elementary school's annual holiday sale. The lady I bought it from said her third grader made it himself.
I believe it,
Gator said. If it had been him, he'd never have admitted his child made something that hideous.
Are you sure it was meant to be a Christmas decoration?
The lights might have been sort of an indication, but if he'd had to guess, he would have said it was some newfangled way to scare mice and rats, or possibly some type of anti-theft device. His lips twitched as he thought of the fancy lady going up the light pole. If his elderly hunting dogs had scared her that badly, that hideous-looking burlap creature would have her high-stepping it to the nearest jail cell and locking herself inside. His mother tugged her bathrobe tie tighter around her waist and gave the burlap snowman a warm glance.
There was something about the snowman that made me feel like I'd met a kindred spirit.
Guilt tightened Gator's throat. He didn't love his mother less because she'd lost a breast and all of her hair, and she'd not complained. Not to him, anyway. But he could see, now that she'd mentioned it, how she might feel like she had something in common with the ugly snowman. He couldn't give her back her breast or her hair, and his heart hurt for the pain she couldn't talk to him about. He set the dustpan on the table and bent over, wrapping his arms around his mother, feeling the unfamiliar frailness, swallowing against the fear that the disease would continue to eat at her until there was nothing left.
I think you're beautiful, Mom.
He managed to get it out without choking. Hopefully, she couldn't tell that her 32-year-old son was trying not to burrow into her arms and sob.
And I think your snowman is beautiful, too. On the inside.
His mother laughed, as he'd hoped she would. She patted his back.
Come on, Avery left us some tofu salad.
He didn't groan, honest. With a sigh, his mother said,
I hate the stuff, but it's supposed to be good for me.
Because of that, he could shove it down his throat, too. And try to be thankful for Avery, who decorated with the knickknacks his mother loved and made her tofu salad because it was good for her.
I'll pretend it's steak.
How hard could it be? Chapter 2.
This is fun,
Avery said to herself.
This is really fun. I actually enjoy this.
She was a liar, and not a very good one. After using her shoulder to push the Finkenbinder's barn door closed, she hefted her tuba up. Normal people did not get up before dawn and go outside in sub-freezing temperatures to practice their tuba away from sane people, just so they didn't wake said sane people up. No one had ever accused Avery of being normal. If she was going to beat out all the men who played the tuba and get that position in the Washington, D.C. Evening Tide Orchestra, she had to be way better than normal. After all, what good was a tubist who didn't have a chair in an orchestra? It's what she'd practiced all her life for, and it's how she proved that her dad walking out on her and her mother didn't really matter. He said she talked too much, had too much hot air. Well, she had taken what he considered a fault, her hot air, and made a successful career out of it. Of course, it was only successful if she were employed, which she would be, once she aced her audition, which she would do since she was going to practice harder than anyone. No matter the cold or the dark, or the fact that she had to do it outside so she didn't wake the Finkenbinders or their children. Thankfully, she could practice her tuba with gloves on. She looked over at the pink sky, then back at the house. Not quite far enough away. The tuba was rather loud, and the Finkenbinders had been kind enough to allow her to stay at their home while she pieced her life back together. The least she could do was keep her tuba in the barn and make sure she was far, far away from the house when she started practicing at this ungodly hour of the morning. It was pretty out, with the sunrise reflecting on the pond, and she wouldn't notice the cold once she started playing. Like all her other problems, the cold seemed to fade away once she got into her music. She might have started taking lessons because her dad had said that she might as well put her lungs to good use, but she'd kept playing because she loved it. Kept playing until she was good enough to be the first woman tubist of the Philadelphia Waterfront Orchestra. No small feat, thank you, and a position she'd held until she lost it last spring. To a man. Drat their bigger lung capacity and the automatic stigma that came from being a female tubist that, say a violinist or harpist did not have to deal with. But there was an opportunity in Washington, D.C., and she was going to get her chair back, just in a different orchestra. She glanced back at the house again and decided she was far enough away. She had her stand and music tossed in a small bag over her shoulder, but she could get started on a few pieces from memory. Shifting her tuba, she brought it to her lips and puffed into the mouthpiece a few times to warm it up. Taking a deep breath, she launched into the Oh Madonna warm-up that she almost always started her practice sessions with. No need for music, and since it was broad and expansive, she could really get into it. The piece never failed to get her in the mood to practice and work hard. Before she'd made it through 2 measures, a flock of birds, ducks maybe, startled by her playing, flapped and flew from the direction of the pond. The unexpected motion made her miss a note, but she'd played the song enough that she picked right back up with barely a hitch and sailed smoothly into the meat of the piece. As always, the music pulled her in, surrounding her, filling her, chasing away the worries and concerns clouding her mind, and pouring peace and joy into her soul. Practice was work, no mistake, but there was something uplifting about playing an instrument with competent skill. She was almost at the end of O Madonna when two shadows came streaking around the far side of the pond toward her. Wolves! Her heart tried to escape out the back of her throat. She'd never heard of any around these parts, but she hadn't been in these parts very long. In 8th grade, she'd read half of a Louis L'Amour book, the only Western she'd ever picked up in her life. As she struggled to lift her tuba off, she tried frantically to remember if the book had mentioned wolves and whether or not they could swim. She couldn't outrun them. She might or might not be able to beat them to death with her tuba. If they didn't swim, the pond was definitely the best option, since there were no trees or light poles handy. Tossing her tuba down, and praying the wolves didn't eat it either, since it represented more money than most people paid for a small car, she careened down the hill and crashed into the pond. She realized right away what she had failed to take into consideration a few seconds ago. It was December, and she was quite likely to die from hypothermia. She just as quickly decided that hypothermia was preferable to being mauled to death. Probably. The wolves had almost come around the edge of the pond, but Avery couldn't quite make herself duck under the water. Too cold. She did, however, manage to make her almost numb legs carry her in until the water was up to her chest. Stopping at the spot where she had splashed in, the wolves stood and barked at her, which triggered a memory. Maybe from the Louis L'Amour book, maybe not, but she thought she remembered that wolves didn't bark. The first rays of cold December sun were coming over the horizon when she turned and squinted at the two animals. Did she recognize them? Same evil eyes, same polished fangs, same hungry look. Gladys and her wicked twin, for sure. And, wouldn't you know it, the same booted mountain man striding along behind. Only now he had a gun slung over his shoulder, and the look on his face wasn't benign humor. He looked mad. Her chest burned. She was the one standing in freezing cold water to escape being eaten alive by his ill-bred, unmannered canines. She was obviously the one who should be angry. She narrowed her eyes. At his command, the dogs stopped barking, but paced along the water's edge, both looking ready to jump in any time. She didn't give him a chance to speak. "This is the second time your dogs have—" As she started speaking, the man stopped so fast his boots skidded. "You?" he asked incredulously, interrupting her tirade. "Yes?" Her teeth had started chattering in earnest, and her feet and legs had gone from cold to painful. "It's me. This is the second time your wild animals have required me to run for my life." "You?" he said again as though he couldn't believe it. "You're the one that was making all the unholy noise. I had everything set up for duck hunting, which took me hours, and you scared them all away." "I'm glad I could save a life," Avery mumbled. For some reason, her tongue wasn't working very well. At least her legs and feet had gone numb. "Oh, crap." The man walked to the edge of the pond. "Get out of there. Now. Before you can't." "Take your dogs and leave first" was on the tip of her tongue, but she couldn't get her mouth to work. The second time in 2 days, which was some sort of record for her. If she were still on speaking terms with her dad, she would have made a note to mention it to him. "Come on, fancy lady. I have no idea what you were doing here at this hour making that horrible racket, but you can't stay in the water.
The dogs didn't bite you yesterday, and I already fed them 2 small kids and a teenager this morning, so they're not hungry."
By this time, Avery had stopped shivering, which was nice because she could grit her teeth. Later, when she wasn't so tired, she would decide for sure whether she would associate with someone who might or might not be feeding his dogs humans. Her eyes wanted to drift shut. She could sleep standing in the water.
"Frig."
The man shrugged off his gun.
"Open your eyes, fancy lady."
She managed to keep her eyes cracked slightly as he bent down and unlaced his boots. Everything seemed to be in slow motion. She could lie on the water and float away. How nice that would be. That irritable man could go blow. His dogs could turn into cuddly, long-haired Persian kittens. Maybe she'd give them a bowl of warm milk. Very warm milk. He splashed into the pond, toward her, his dogs beside him. She wanted to turn and run away, to get away from the dogs and away from the big mountain man, but her body wasn't cooperating. If only she could take a nap, if she could rest for a few minutes, she'd be able to run from the dogs again. The confounded fancy woman didn't have the sense God gave a goose, or a duck, for that matter. Swooping her up right as she closed her eyes completely and started to sink into the water, Gator turned and strode with confidence out of the frigid pond and toward Fink and Ellie Finkenbinder's old farmhouse. They probably wouldn't be up this early on a Saturday, but having grown up beside Ellie, he knew they wouldn't mind a bit opening up their house to someone in need. It might not even be locked. Gator tried to shrug off his annoyance that the fancy woman had scared his ducks away. It wasn't exactly easy to go duck hunting. He'd gotten up before dawn and been down by the pond for over 2 hours in this freezing weather. If it hadn't been extreme stupidity on her part, he'd not be so upset. But seriously? What kind of woman walks around in the dark, making a ridiculous racket on some kind of overgrown trumpet, then, for no reason whatsoever, walks straight into a pond that could only have been a few degrees above freezing? No one with a brain. She was smaller than she seemed. He hurried his already fast walk. He might be irritated, but he didn't want her to die.
"And if you die, I'm not really going to feed you to my dogs."
"I don't believe you,"
she slurred. Her lips were blue, her face pale. The eyes that had spit fire and sass last night were closed. Dark lashes rested on porcelain skin. He grunted. Even suffering from hypothermia, she wouldn't be silenced. But her eyes hadn't opened.
"I should call 911.
He said to himself as much as to her. In order to do that, he'd have to go back to his duck blind to get his phone.
"No insurance,"
she whispered. That gave him pause. Yesterday, he judged her as privileged by her clothing. Today, she wore the same fancy coat and what looked like expensive jeans and boots. He had to admit, everything he knew about fashion he'd learned from his ex-wife. He tucked that mystery away for another time. He could commiserate with the no insurance. He'd actually been formulating a plan to try to pay his mother's astronomically high deductibles and co-insurance, and Fink was the man he needed to talk to. His idea hadn't exactly been to barge into Fink's house just after dawn on Saturday morning, but... He took the porch steps 2 at a time and pounded on the door with his elbow. It opened as he shifted to try to reach the knob.
"Gator?"
Ellie Finkenbinder, in bright purple pants and a t-shirt, her hair in wild tangles around her head, blinked up at him like she expected him to disappear with the morning fog. Then her eyes widened.
Avery!
The woman in his arms nodded weakly. Gator's jaw dropped. Was this his mother's Avery? She was in the pond. He couldn't quite bring himself to say that she walked into it of her own accord. Ellie seemed to know her. If Avery was certified crazy, then Ellie wouldn't be surprised. But if Avery was truly that petrified of his elderly hunting dogs, then he didn't have enough time to explain it. Ellie bustled him through the kitchen and into the living room, where she directed him to lay Avery on the couch.
Go to the laundry room off the kitchen and start the dryer. There's a load of towels in there that I haven't gotten out and folded yet. We'll get them warm. Put some hot water on the stove.
Gator headed out of the room.
I'm taking her wet clothes off, so don't come back in until I say, and be sure to stop Fink and the boys if they come down the stairs.
Got it, Gator said. The laundry room off the kitchen was easy to find. He started the dryer, then kept an ear out for footsteps while he put water on the stove to boil. The heat of the kitchen felt good on his wet clothes and stocking feet. Ellie appeared in the doorway.
Bring me 2 towels, then start the dryer again.
He obeyed. As he handed the towels over, she said,
She's awake, but still slurring her words. I know she doesn't think she can afford to go to the hospital.
Ellie bit her lip and gazed off into the distance. Because of his job as a forest ranger out in Montana, this wasn't the first case of hypothermia he'd seen. He'd actually suffered from a few mild cases himself. Ellie was doing all the right things. I've dealt with hypothermia before. I think she'll be okay, as long as she's breathing and her heart rate is steady.
I'd feel more comfortable if you'd check her. She's covered.
Gator glanced into the room where fancy Lady Avery lay on the couch. Something tugged at his heart and his feet started moving before he'd even decided to go. Make her a cup of tea, and you can make sure she gets a few swallows. Warming from the inside out. He'd feel better if she were in the hospital, but he could respect her desire to not go. He'd rather die than rack up a bill he couldn't pay. He also would have bet a boatload of cash that fancy Lady Avery could have paid for an ER visit. Appears he'd have been wrong.
I'll do it.
Ellie grabbed the towels and hustled back into the living room.
I'll also get more warm towels.
Great, Gator said, as his feet took him to Avery's side. Her teeth chattered together, her small body shaking under the blankets, and immediately his anxiety dissipated. For a hypothermia victim, shivering was good. He stopped beside the couch, somehow wary of touching her. Maybe because of her sharp tongue, but more because he found himself wanting to touch her. To run his finger down her cheek, curve his hand around the angle of her chin, and bury it in her hair. Which was crazy, but he couldn't tell that to his heavily thumping heart. Shaking the feeling off, he reached deep for a mask of clinical dispassion as he touched 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a heartbeat, praying it was strong and even. Her eyes snapped open. He almost yanked his hand back, like he'd been taking advantage of her. Their eyes met, and the thumping in his heart became painful. He pushed his fingers forward, murmuring, "Just want to make sure your heartbeat is strong and steady."
Really?
She asked weakly.
Are you sure you weren't planning on strangling me and feeding me to your dogs?
Her pulse was steady, and even a little fast under his fingers. They prefer to kill their own victims. Her hand slipped up and out of the blankets, grabbing his wrist. Her fingers didn't quite make it the whole way around. He broke eye contact to stare at the contrast of the pink shine of her nails against his dark skin.
So you're saving me so you have dog food tomorrow?
She asked. with a little more of the familiar sass back in her voice. Oh yeah, she was going to be fine. He was actually more worried about himself.
I have a whole basement full of people chained to the wall. You're safe for at least a month.
I'm Christmas dinner then.
You're too small for Christmas dinner. Maybe an appetizer.
You're one of those people who discriminate against people because of their size, like you did one thing to be as tall as you are. There's nothing wrong with being short. Short people have feelings too.
Avery took a breath to continue, but before she could, Ellie spoke from over his shoulder.
You're feeling better. I have to admit, I was a little concerned when you came in and didn't have much to say.
Gator stretched to his feet, hoping Ellie hadn't noticed he'd had his hand on Avery's neck way longer than it took to grab a pulse. His wrist tingled with a funny feeling of awareness, and he fought the urge to hide his hand behind his back. He hadn't been doing anything wrong. Avery's cheeks reddened.
Sorry, some people seem to have this ability to raise the heat level in others, but I guess that's what I needed.
She narrowed her eyes at Gator.
Fink's in the kitchen,
Ellie said to Gator with a smile.
Maybe you can help him finish the tea.
He could recognize a dismissal when he heard one. Without looking at the frustrating fancy woman again, he grabbed the pile of cooled towels and headed out of the room. Fink sat at the kitchen table.
Gator, I thought I heard a deep voice in there.
Fink looked askance at the cool towels in Gator's hand. He explained about Avery while walking the towels back to the washroom.
She's on the couch warming up. I'm on tea duty.
I see. Wow. Fink rubbed the back of his neck. Avery has been so considerate about practicing her tuba where she won't wake or bother us. It never occurred to me that it's getting cold outside. I thought she stayed in the barn with it.
Maybe she usually does.
Is the tuba still outside?
Yeah, I'll run out and get it once the tea is done.
I'm sure her case is in the barn, Fink said.
Okay.
Fink rubbed his head. That old barn is liable to fall down any day. I've been looking for someone to either re-side it or tear it down.
I wanted to talk to you about that.
Fink, with his straight carriage and serious expression, looked every bit the high school principal, even in the matching striped pajamas. He rubbed his chin. You used to do construction work.
Yeah. In high school during summer break, I worked with my grandpa. Old barn boards are bringing top dollar right now. In fact, I have a buyer in mind, but I wanted to talk to you first. If you're serious about tearing it down, I'll give you a competitive estimate. You can even price match it.
After trying 2 cupboard doors, Gator found the mugs and grabbed one. Fink walked to a canister and pulled out a tea bag. I actually have 3 estimates on my desk. Ellie wanted me to get a price on re-siding it, too. She's attached to the old thing and thinks it would be romantic to keep it. Gator sniffed.
Probably would be. I'm guessing the re-siding estimate might have debased her on the romanticism of keeping it.
Large sums of money have a way of shooting holes in the best laid dreams. She did say that Avery and she had a few ideas of how the barn could make money and could be an asset to our business. But the cash out up front is considerable.
If you decide to tear it down, I'd love to be able to submit an estimate.
Gator took the tea bag and dropped it in the mug. Steam rolled from the water on the stove. I'll show you what the other guys offered. You let me know if you can match it. You're my neighbor. Even if you can't match them, if you're in the ballpark, I'm hiring you. I know Ellie will feel the same. He paused with his hand on the refrigerator door. If we decide to re-side, would you be interested in that? Gator hated to turn down the work, but on his limited leave of absence from his job, he only had time to do one barn. He needed the extra money he'd make from selling the old boards. There were 2 or 3 other barns in the area he could make an offer on.
I can only do one job before the New Year's when I have to be back in Montana. Mom has some bills, and I wanted to make enough to take care of them before I leave. To do that, I need the extra from selling the boards.
Fink set a carton of orange juice on the table. I get it. Let me talk to Ellie and make sure we're on the same page. She, Avery, and Jillian spent a whole afternoon here at the kitchen table last weekend dreaming up ways for the barn to make money.
Jillian?
A relative, same as Avery. They came out to help this summer when I was laid up, and they've both stayed through the busy season. Another woman just like Avery? He wasn't sure the world could handle 2 of her. But he didn't say anything. Fink seemed fond of her. He rubbed his wrist where her fingers had clasped it.
What are they going to do with the barn? Get a herd of Holsteins and start milking them?
Fink laughed as he pulled a glass from the cupboard. No, they did talk about putting a dog kennel in, which Avery was not overly fond of. Fink's voice lowered like he was telling a secret. She's not a big dog person. Or turning it into a storage facility for boats or RVs. We've used it as a haunted barn in autumns past, but the insurance company is balking at insuring it unless we do some major upgrades. We need to justify the expense with anticipated income.
Yeah, I get it.
Gator poured the boiling water onto the tea bag in the mug. I think we decided it wasn't worth it, but it's not worth my wife giving me the silent treatment for the next month if I came to the wrong conclusion from our conversation. Gator's face twitched. Knowing Ellie, Fink was probably joking, but Gator knew all about getting the silent treatment. Kristen had given him that for the majority of their marriage.
That's fine. I'm going to run down and gather up the oversized trumpet. While I'm down there, I'll look around, but to do a proper estimate, I'll need to come back some other time with a tape measure and some other stuff.
Fink drained his glass. That's fine. By the time you get back, I should have those estimates dug up.
Great.
Gator walked over to the doorway and peeked in.
How's she doing?
Ellie turned from her position on the chair beside the couch. She wants to get up. Gator glimpsed Avery's sparkling eyes. Something pulled him toward her, but he resisted.
I'm getting the trumpet thing.
Avery's gaze lifted to meet his. His heart tripped, and that annoying protective instinct caught at his neck again. He couldn't read her expression. It didn't matter anyway. He turned and strode out of the kitchen. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.